Top scientist Professor Salim Abdul Karim is warning against doctors continuing to prescribe ineffective COVID treatments such as ivermectin and fluvoxamine. And now he says there is new information, new science-based research that proves unequivocally that they do not work. He joins us now. Prof, talk to us about this news, which I understand is fairly hot off the press. In the early days, the jury was out somewhat on drugs such as ivermectin for treating COVID, but now there's data from about 3 million patients. Tell us about it.
Good evening, Sally, and good evening to all of the viewers. You're quite right. So when you go back to 2020, we didn't really have sound evidence for treatments. And so there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of people trying new treatments and using existing medications and repurposing them. And in that rush, there were some studies that were done that were not that well done. And as a result, they produced results that couldn't be replicated, that several trials, several studies subsequently failed to replicate those original findings. And usually it's because those studies either were too small or were not well conducted. But that was the situation in 2020, when we could use a lot of judgment and just experiment with new treatments. In 2022, we now have several clinical trials, several rigorous studies that show quite well that when you look at the 3 medications that were studied in the COVID out trial, the 2 of them, fluvoxamine and ivermectin, there's now solid evidence to suggest that neither of them have any benefit. And this new trial, published today, literally just a few hours ago, that trial, the COVID out trial, shows quite clearly and confirms all of the accumulating evidence that both fluvoxamine and ivermectin have no clinical benefit at all for patients with COVID-19.
So I'm listening to you and I believe you, but I know that there are loads of people, or maybe not that many, but there are people who go, well, it worked for me and I don't care what all those trials say. Is there any harm in that approach, in people going, you know what, it did work for me and I still think it worked somehow? Is there a problem with a physician, for example, who says, you know what, I still want to prescribe it?
Well, there are, and there are 3 problems. And that's why using and prescribing medications that are not effective is not just a harmless option. It does 3 things that are problematic. The first is that when you're taking an ineffective medication, you are often not taking medication that is effective, in which case you're not benefiting from what solid evidence shows is effective treatment. And the WHO provides a table in which they provide each of the drugs that is being used for COVID-19, and they say these are medications we recommend against. And these are medications we recommend for. And my problem is that patients who are getting the wrong medications the World Health Organization says you should not use, are not getting the ones that they should be using. The second is that all medications come with some side effects. And if you're not deriving a benefit, because there's no clinical benefit from the medication, you're just having to put up with the side effects, which then outweigh the benefits. And finally, as we saw with hydroxychloroquine, when you start reusing repurposed medication, that you'll end up using the stocks of the drug that people who really need it, as we saw in patients who had systemic lupus who needed hydroxychloroquine, couldn't get it because all the COVID patients were taking it. So there are negative effects to treating patients incorrectly with medications that the World Health Organization specifically says that you shouldn't use.
So, Prof, you know, in the minds of most of us in South Africa, we know that people are still getting COVID-19. We also know that there's an immunity of around 90%, whether through naturally acquired or through vaccination. And there's a sense that this ship has moved on. Of course, we know that people are still getting sick at times, still something we need to keep an eye on, but certainly nowhere near the levels of concern at the height of the pandemic. But what are the new developments and the new learnings from COVID-19? I was reading something recently about the really worrying impact of long COVID, that it's becoming an entire long-term systemic problem.
When we were first trying to grapple with this disease, and I remember as we were trying to figure it all out initially, that we understood it from its name, right? It's a acute respiratory syndrome. And so we thought it was essentially an acute lung infection. But it didn't take long before the first evidence of long-term sequelae became available. Now, 2.5 years into the pandemic, we now have several studies that show that there are quite substantial long-term sequelae. Let me give you one example. There's a more than 50% increase in the risk of heart disease, and particularly three conditions: heart attacks, stroke, and myocarditis. Now, that increased risk occurs regardless of whether your initial COVID-19 infection was mild or asymptomatic or severe. So that means there are billions of people who become infected with this virus, that we are now going to see more cases of heart attacks. We're likely to see more cases of stroke, all because they were infected with COVID-19. So we have to be continuing to be on our guard to try and minimize the risk of infection, because it's not just the acute disease we're worried about now. We have to think about its long-term sequelae. Though I should point out that we don't know what the next variant is going to look like. And the next variant may well be able to escape some of our immunity and may lead to more infections all over again. And so that's why it's important for us to ensure that we have in our armamentarium a set of drugs that we know are effective and that will prevent and reduce the risk of patients getting severe disease.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Always such a pleasure. Professor Salim Abdul Karim there.